Superman! I saw Superman today. Who knows why I'm making a video about a movie? Not that I haven't done this before. If you've been paying attention to the channel for a long time, you've probably seen I've done these before. I'm not saying you watched them, you probably didn't. And I'm not making this to be seen, I'm making this to be heard. I'm making it so that I've made it, and so that I've spoken my thoughts out into the ether, basically. Because I don't actually have anyone to talk to about the film at the moment. I saw it by myself, which, by the way, is fine. I think there needs to be... there isn't much stigma towards it, but there needs to be no stigma, in my opinion, towards seeing movies by yourself, because you're sitting in a dark room for 2 hours and you're not allowed to talk to the person next to you anyway, or at least it's frowned upon to do so. Why the hell should you not be able to do that by yourself? If it's part of a larger group activity and you're going to do something else afterwards, like go get some food, that's fine. But I basically just shotgunned this. I just went out, saw Superman, and came home. And so I'd rather do that by myself, to be honest, in general, because it's such a lightweight activity in doing that. And I'm really just going there to watch the film and just see what I make of it. Not, without the necessity to have a discussion about it with someone afterwards. Not that I didn't proffer it to Tyler, the other, half of the channel, Not so much at the moment, but of course, he's so apathetic towards Superman that it didn't even matter. I wanted to hang out with him. And of course, it would have been difficult to get anyone else involved beyond that, because of that. It's just yeah, okay, I don't really want to make this a big deal anyway, so I'm going to see it by myself, and I did, and I was very happy to do so, and I'm very happy that I have done so, because Superman, directed by James Gunn, starring David Corenswet, Nicholas Hoult, Rachel Brosnahan, Edie Gafigi, I hope I'm saying his name right because he's awesome, Nathan Fillion, Isabella Merced, Wendell Pierce, Skylar Gisondo, Sarah Sampaio, hope I'm pronouncing her name right as well, other people. Am I missing anyone big? I don't think I am. Oh, Anthony Carrigan. Superman was pretty fucking great, actually. I definitely didn't know what to make of the film before going in. I didn't really have a proper expectation. And I was also thinking that a lot of the film had not been shown. And that's true. There's a lot in this film that's not in the trailers. I think some people feel that's not the case. That is the case in one very specific way, by the way. And I will get into spoilers later. But I kind of just want to pontificate, if you excuse the pretentious word there. I kind of just want to pontificate about the film and how it went by, because I think this is a really interesting way to start a new DC universe. I don't know what to make of it as far as the film's intentions go. It's a larger piece of a puzzle, because I know that James Gunn doesn't really see it that way. He knows that it is, but he didn't make the film that way. And I think that's both entirely true and not true. I think as storytelling, as a Superman story, it is a contained Superman story, but it is also absolutely an introduction to this world, which is why I loved the opening, the very opening, because it opens with some basically introductory text explaining the world. We already know from interviews that we're jumping into this new DC universe. It's a world where metahumans have been around for 300 years, and what the introduction says is that 30 years is when Superman came to Earth. 3 years ago is when Superman revealed himself, basically. So I guess that's I think he is literally meant to be 30 years old. So it's a 27-year-old Superman when he first reveals himself to, introduced himself to the world as Superman. So he's been doing it for 3 years, and it kind of feels like that. I think 3 years is almost a little bit too much time to have gone past for what happens in the film, though. It feels like this stuff would have happened maybe sometime soon after the first year had passed, is what I would imagine the events in the film would have taken hold. And I found the film somewhat strange in its pacing, only because I think there is one very key dynamic in the film. I think personally for me is quite undercooked, and it's a very important one. And I don't know if I'm going to save that for spoilers as well. What I want to say, I think the cast of this film is fantastic. I think what they've done here is some really clever moves in terms of casting, with a very forward-facing perspective, right? Knowing that these characters will continue, especially David Corenswet as Superman. Now, I love Man of Steel, and this is where I'm going to sort of bite the bullet and really out myself. I'm a massive Henry Cavill fan, and I love Man of Steel, and I actually adore Batman v Superman. Specifically the Ultimate Edition. I think I've only seen the theatrical cut once, and it is subpar compared to the Ultimate Edition. It's honestly, I actually love everything about Batman v Superman, so that puts me in a weird position. Fortunately for me, I have the very apparently rare blessing of being able to enjoy more than one type of media. So I was entirely okay with a completely different tone, because the tone is so different from what was done with Zack Snyder's stuff, basically. With that DC universe, where it was sort of like, it started with some Zack Snyder movies, and then they tried to make every other film like a Zack Snyder movie, but also not at the same time, where everything should have just had its own distinct tone, which I think is absolutely what James Gunn is going for. We'll have to see. We actually haven't got anything else out of this universe yet, except Creature Commandos, and those are two things made by James Gunn, and you can tell there are very different tones there. I haven't seen Creature Commandos because I think it is available. I think it would be on Now TV, I think, but you cannot watch these HBO Max shows in the UK at the time that they're airing, which I think is really stupid. Like, I'm not going to be able to watch Lanterns, and I want to watch Lanterns, especially with more Nathan Fillion in it, because I love Nathan Fillion. But I didn't really get back to David Corenswet. The point was, I love Henry Cavill, and I think he was actually very good for his version of Superman. I think especially in Man of Steel, I think he's actually, I know some sort of weird notions about him as an actor, but I think that's only because Snyder let some bad takes pass in BVS. I think that's all it is. I think he's actually overall good in BVS, but I think there's two things that he kind of doesn't do as well as he should have done, or at least Snyder used the worst takes off, as far as I'm concerned, which is when he's crying after the Capitol building bombing, and the Save Martha bit, which I think, unfortunately, I think is somewhat hampered by Henry's performance. And that's what I can say about David Corenswet. I mean, obviously, like I said, I do think it is in take selection. I think there are examples of Henry Cavill being like a perfect performer. I think he's perfect as Geralt of Rivia, like in The Witcher. It's such a shame that he had to leave the show, because it is actually a fantastic performance. So if anyone really doubts him as an actor, watch that. Watch season 3, actually, because he's actually at his best in season 3, even though that's probably where the writing is least witchery. The point is, though, David Corenswet is perfect. He's incredible as Superman. I think it's a really fantastic take on the character. It really speaks to me because, like I said, I can enjoy a variety of tones, and as much as I like the epic mythological stance that is present in Snyder's film specifically, Snyder's Superman film, so, Man of Steel, BVS, Justice League, Snyder Cut, of course, I really enjoy that. It really speaks to me. I do have this love of this big mythological approach of like gods among men, and how that sort of plays out. But I'm also a massive optimist. I love the world. I love people. I believe in hope and truth and justice and the American way. Not so much that, but basically just seeing a guy who literally thinks it's cool to be nice spoke to me, as much as things like BVS's big clashing of gods and men speaks to me on an aesthetic level. This version of Superman speaks to me on a principality level, as in, me and him are quite similar in terms of how we view the world, with just like kindness is sort of the most important thing, and just doing good above all else is really what matters. And I think that was just so heavily pushed and so present throughout his character that it kind of elevated every scene with him, because I felt that belief shining through even in his sort of most troubling moments in the film. I kind of really only have two criticisms, I think, or maybe 3. Not 4. I wouldn't say 4. It's just, but they're all kind of quite big spoilers. One thing I think I can talk about without spoiling is how strong Superman is, right? And by the way, I don't think that Henry Cavill's version is not overpowered at all. He's not even close to comic Superman. And David Corenswet's Superman is quite a few steps below Cavill's. And that's my biggest criticism. I think the Superman is far too weak. And not that I think it's bad to make him weaker than he normally is. Like, I understand that. And I think but I think there is an element here of James Gunn's sensibilities taking over in a way that is somewhat unchecked, where I think my impression is that he made a decision very early on to make this Superman much weaker, and that kind of just carried all the way through to the final film. Because, not that I need him to be overpowered, and he's very, very far from overpowered, but I feel like it's not even that he's too weak. I just think he's not good enough at his job. He's good at saving people. He's not that good at fighting. There are still some really cool fight scenes with Superman, as you'd expect, but he does not feel like a fighter so much. And that's okay in some cases. I just don't feel like... I feel like he just kind of... James Gunn kind of tanked him a bit too much, and tried to make Superman literally human rather than spiritually human. Which I know doesn't make sense because he's still, many times stronger than a human. But I think he was just like, I need this guy to be weaker. And in my opinion, he took that too far. I think you do need to make Superman weaker than he is in the comics. I think you have to. I think the only time Superman should ever be as strong as he's been in the comics is when you've built up to it over a long amount of time. Like, it shouldn't even be in a Justice League movie. It should be in the final endgame of a DC universe, like a DC cinematic franchise, right? That's the only time you should have Superman be at actual full tilt, under the light of a... I don't think it's a specific sun that gets him to like the most powerful state, or is it cosmic armor Superman is when he's at his strongest. Which, by the way, in terms of aesthetics though, I wasn't huge on the look for Superman going in, and I've kind of changed on that. I feel like I changed on that before going in anyway. It was just the very first look at Superman I wasn't a huge fan of, because I think the suit, there is a weird approach here, and I still would not have done it this way myself. Weird thing to say, I'm not a filmmaker, but Superman's suit, it is MCUified a little bit. It's got lines on it that don't need to be there, like it just does. At the same time, David Corenswet looks fantastic in it, and I think the trunks are carried off really well. You get to the point in the film, there's one specific shot, and I think I understand now why people have been highlighting it. Specific shot of him sort of standing with the camera slightly upturned, a slight angle upwards at him, and he's sort of like somewhat battle damaged but also very strong looking, and he fits into the suit very well. He put in a lot of work for this, and you can tell. You look at David Corenswet before this and now, like before shooting something that was in before, not Twisters though. I think he was already working out, but he hadn't got the role yet. He looks pretty good in Twisters, but anything before Twisters, compare that to now, he looked quite a difference. And that's what I think is so cool, because I haven't seen him in anything apart from Twisters. He's kind of a new actor. He's 32 years old, yes, but in Hollywood terms, that is not even slightly old. So it's very fun to have a completely fresh face from the casting of Superman. And the film is kind of like that as well, overall. In fact, everyone except Nicholas Hoult as Lex Luthor is like below the A-list. And Nicholas Hoult is not high up. He's definitely an A-lister, but he's not. I wouldn't say he's high up in that list. He's not the kind of guy who's getting films greenlit, but he is the kind of guy who clearly is not out. He's a very employed individual. But everyone else, even sort of all the older actors, I think the closest to being quite famous is Nathan Fillion, just because he's been around for so long. And I think it's fair to talk about the supporting cast now. I do really appreciate the existence of the Justice Gang. It's not a great name, is it? But they do really help to fill out the world, because it's very present, it's very evident and explicit. There's nothing hidden about the fact that this is a world filled with fantastical elements and metahumans that have been around for hundreds of years. So there's going to be these groups that are going to show up, and this is kind of just this one that operates within Metropolis, which is Green Lantern, Guy Gardner as Green Lantern, Mr. Terrific, and Hawkgirl, who were all pretty good. And I'm a big Nathan Fillion fan, so Guy Gardner was actually great. He was very fun to watch as Guy Gardner, and I think there is a philosophy to this that makes perfect sense, which James Gunn basically is just like, these are just people in Superman's life, basically. They are not there to carry the film. They're not there to set up like spin-offs, although some are definitely happening. There's like a Mr. Terrific series could be in the works. Guy Gardner is going to show up in the Lantern series, even though that's more focused on Hal Jordan and Jon Stewart. They're just there because that's the world that we're inhabiting, and it's natural that a Superman who's been around for a couple of years is going to have some associates who are in a similar ballpark to him, or at least do what he does as well. Not a similar ballpark; they're all much weaker. Although I'd say this Green Lantern looks pretty actually fairly strong, actually, to be honest. There's also politics to talk about in this film, and I'm not going to go into detail. I'm especially not going to go into detail about what's analogous to what, because frankly, I think it's rather obvious. And hats off to James Gunn for doing that, for the balls to do that. And it's part of also the introduction. There's sort of some stuff that's been set up. It's sort of implied in the trailers that Superman has intervened in a sort of war scenario between two countries, especially in the scene between. There's that clip of Lois and Clark when he does the interview as Superman, right? It's like where he allows her to interview him as Superman, and that comes up a lot. Speaking of that kind of thing. I think this film was marketed not incorrectly per se, but I think this version of Superman was maybe marketed incorrectly. I'm not sure. Basically, I think the marketing gave dishonest detractors more ammunition than it should have done. And I'm talking about the people who basically want this movie to fail, who were either very anti-DC or anti-woke hooligans who for some reason think that because there's a woman and a person of colour in a film, that means the writing's terrible, right? Those kind of people, and they're real. Don't deny it. They're very real people, and it's a shame that we have to share the earth with them. But I think the marketing gave them some ammunition, especially where there's a lot of scenes of Superman, for example, kind of just yelling. There's a scene where he breaks into basically LexCorp and just starts shouting at Lex for a good reason. And it's also the scene between him and Lois, like I was just describing. They put that clip out, but it was a cut together to have the scene escalate much quicker than it does. That scene's like 10 minutes long, and it's brilliant. It's actually that actually almost saves the relationship I was talking about, right? Which you probably know what that is now. I don't think it was actually fleshed out enough, but that, like I said, that scene is 10 minutes, and the heights that he gets to is like the last 2 minutes. In fact, probably the second to last minute, and that's it. So the 9th minute of that conversation is when he's like that. It really does build to it, and you completely understand why he is upset, basically. Same thing goes for later on when he breaks into LexCorp, or LuthorCorp, by the way. They called it LuthorCorp, which is better. I shouldn't say correct. It's how they did it in Smallville, so there's some precedent for it. Although I think that is literally just James Gunn being good friends with Michael Rosenbaum. But I think it makes more sense, obviously, because that means it could have been owned by Lex's father. It would make more sense. Even though I think in BVS, it's Lex Luthor's father who created LexCorp, because his father is also called Alexander Luthor. Anyway, that kind of covers all that, I suppose. I just think the marketing was like not that the marketing was dishonest, but it wasn't. It was selective in a way that I don't think was as complimentary as it could have been. Basically, same goes for things like Crypto, sort of showing Crypto being an annoying shit ass dog, which he is, by the way. He is. That's because he's a super dog, but he's still a dog. So yeah, he's gonna like pounce on Superman and hurt him without realizing, because that's just, as far as he's concerned, it's just play. Anyway, I think there's still a lot of stuff to cover. I think the more recurring shortcomings are sort of more on a sort of VFX side and sort of cinematography side, which is James Gunn has created some amazing like visual work, but I don't think he treats film like as much of a visual medium as other directors do. And yeah, I do mean Zack Snyder, because where this film is a downgrade, where I think this film is a definitive step down from something like Man of Steel, is that it's a much less visually striking experience. There are still some really interesting shots. I remember James Gunn talking about some of the action and the flying sequences being inspired by Top Gun Maverick specifically, and I do see that, but I didn't find much of the action particularly exciting before the third act, and I didn't think the actual framing of the visuals was particularly special, except for a few select cases. And I think it's because that's the way James Gunn sees things. I think he sees things more like he wants to highlight certain moments rather than the whole thing be, rather than the every frame a painting approach that someone like Snyder has. Which, as far as film visuals go, I do prefer the Snyder approach to the Gunn approach. On the character side of things, and there's also just VFX. the visual effects overall are fine. And I think they do fit the pretty campy tone. By the way, not as campy as I was expecting. I think this film is. I think obviously sincerity and campiness go hand in hand, but I think this film is more sincere than it is camp, right? I think it still has an edge to it that makes sense, but CGI was not always up to par. At least how the camera tracks CGI people, right? There is one thing that I want to bring up because it's an interesting idea, right? Is a scene that you're going to remember, right, forever, or something like that. I saw someone talking about it. It's like, that's something that this film lacks. I think that's weird to say, because I don't see how you could forget a lot of scenes in this. And there's one in particular I thought that is definitely going to be the most striking for me that I'm going to remember. Anyway, I think it's time to get into spoilers, and I want to be pretty quick with spoilers. Ratings are kind of arbitrary, but I still personally like to give them, so here it is. What that is, by the way, this 8 out of 10. It's an 8 out of 10 with the very express thing of those two missing points are definitively missing, right? This is not a perfect film, but the 8 points on which I do enjoy it, I really enjoyed it. The what's good about this film is fantastic for me. What's bad about it is not super bad, the film super bad, but it's definitely on my mind and it's sort of weighing against it. And the biggest one for me, I've already talked about the Superman being weak thing, too weak for my taste. I personally felt like the relationship between Clark and Lois was underbaked. It's not, which sounds stupid, it's not underbaked on the actor's part. They play it very well. It's underbaked in the story that we are viewing. There is more history here than is shown, basically. And that's why I think the film could have been longer, because we're in spoilers now. Spoiler territory. Superman was sent to Earth to conquer it. He's a Viltrumite. By the way, Bradley Cooper is Jor-El. There you go. There's something. Supergirl's in the film at the end. Other things. But I don't know what to make of that twist. And I think the film could have been a bit longer, because I think we should have seen more from Superman's past. Not for this to be an origin film, but I think we should have seen some earlier moments. I don't even necessarily need to know when they first met. Maybe when Superman first met like the Justice Gang, or when he first started being Superman. I don't need to see stuff like that, but I want maybe childhood flashbacks. I know that Man of Steel does that, but I'm only suggesting that because without them, Man of Steel would have had a lot less character. It would have been too tight, basically. And this film is very tight. It's 2 hours and 10 minutes, which is obviously not long, but also not short. I think it could have been 10 minutes longer. I think it could have done with just a little bit more meat in terms of the past. It's very present, right? It starts with a thing talking about how Superman basically stops the nation of Baravia, 2 made-up nations, Baravia, from invading Jaranpa. I think that's what everyone's called. And that basically afterwards he was assailed. After he returned to Metropolis, he was assailed by the Hammer of Baravia, which is actually a sort of mech suit piloted by Ultraman, who is a clone of Superman. And that's basically told to us in the opening text crawl. I was kind of expecting it to flash back to when he first intervened. I don't actually need it to. That's not the kind of thing I'm talking about, but I was still kind of expecting it. It didn't happen. And I think there are other times where flashbacks could have happened, because there's a very specific way the movie ends that I think could have been handled, not necessarily handled better, but supplemented by things that could have happened earlier in the film. Because Jonathan and Martha Kent don't have much of a presence in the film. Very well cast. Taylor Pruitt-Vince, I think, is Jonathan Kent, and Neva Howe is Martha Kent, who is lovely. She's such a sweet, old lady. It's really nice. But Pa Kent's also fantastic. But they have very little screen time. And what happens at the end of the film, there's this sort of through line of this message that Superman has basically pretty much on repeat when he's in the Fortress of Solitude, or maybe more specifically whenever he comes back injured, right? It's a message that his parents sent with him, which is talking about how he's there to do as much good as possible, right? That's why they sent him to Earth. And then Lex basically finds out that the message is actually there's more to the message, and it basically talks about how they sent him to Earth to become a conqueror, and that he should just kill everyone that he can, or that anyone that disobeys him. I think it's a bit too on the nose, and I was expecting it to be doctored. I was expecting it to be, and it also sounds kind of like it. I am wondering if maybe it actually is, and they're kind of saving that, because it basically causes Clark to dismiss his Kryptonian heritage and replace the footage of his parents, his biological parents, with his adopted parents at the end of the film, which was really nice, by the way. That was a really nice touch. I mean, look, like I said, this film spoke to me on a level of principality. So there were actually moments that I adored, like genuinely. I think it was, what was the moment? There's something really specific. The kind of thing that I wouldn't want to forget. There's something that basically, I remember. It's when Superman saved a squirrel. It almost made me cry, because I just think that's so correct. That's so Superman. And I think there's a lot of people that don't see that. And I think something that I always had a problem with is that Henry Cavill so clearly himself understood that, where Snyder kind of just didn't care about that side of Superman. I think Cavill could have done this. It wouldn't have been right, because I think James Gunn had specific vision for what point the Superman was at, and I don't think it would have worked, especially with all the things in that universe. It would have been crossing boundaries. I think this is a better Lex Luthor, things like that. But I still think he clearly wanted to do things this way, and I think we're very lucky, though, to have someone who is really on that track already. David Corenswet starting his Superman journey this way is very promising. I think now is always the problem with Cavill. It didn't start in the right place for where they wanted to end up being. They wanted to end up at the beginning, basically, and I don't know. It wasn't a proper rise before the fall for that version of Superman. This version could absolutely go down a bizarre, not bizarre, but the anti-life equation thing at some point, and that would work because he's been so positive and so beloved beforehand. And I think I just want to wrap this up, though, because I think I've kind of just got pretty much everything out of my head. I don't know if people are going to agree with me that the Lois and Clark relationship is underbaked. But there is. The last thing I'll end on is the scene that I think I'm going to remember, which is, there isn't a scene that is like First Flight, right? With, the crazy, I'll talk about the music in a moment as well, but the crazy Hans Zimmer score for First Flight. Actually, I think in the soundtrack, the track is just called Flight. It's amazing. It's a fantastic scene. Never going to forget it. This film doesn't have a scene like that in terms of Superman's journey. He's basically at full swing from the start, right? He's learned exactly how to use his powers and whatnot. Speaking of which, he takes far too long to use his laser eyes for the first time. He doesn't use them at any point before the third act, which I think is a little strange. Unless I somehow missed that, because I don't think he uses them against the kaiju or anything. But what I'm going to remember is a scene where basically the engineer puts these nanites inside Superman. They're basically slowly killing him, removing the air from his lungs, and he just figures out a way to handle it. He flies straight up and then goes straight back down, and it plays out a lot more elaborately than that, and that's what I'm going to remember. The pacing, that was probably the most tense action sequence. I think it was actually really strong. Music. The music is a reorientation of the John Williams theme, which I'm not a fan of. I think it's fantastic. I think John Williams is a genius, and it's one of the most iconic movie themes of all time. But it's too hokey for me. I take heroism, I think, more seriously than that, in the sense of I don't need a silly theme. Which, by the way, if you want to get mad at me for not liking the original Superman theme, that's actually understandable. I'm probably wrong to be saying these things. I think they do a really good job here, though, of making it making it less hokey. If you just take it and make it a more heroic version, I feel, of that original theme. I still disagree with using it. I still personally think the film should have had an original score. It does. Everything's been recomposed, but I mean, I don't believe in reusing stuff in that way. I understand why they did, but I disagree with it. But it's not worse off for it either. I just wish they would have been able to create a more iconic, a new and iconic score, because Hans Zimmer did it. He did. Anyway, I think that about does it. It's a great film. It's a really cool, straightforward Superman film with a lot going on, but at the same time, you never really lose track of what's going on. I think it's actually a much more, I think it's a much cleverer script than people are giving credit for. I think the dialogue is actually less clever than the story itself, if you know what I mean. Because as great as Nicholas Hoult was as Lex Luthor, there were times where he explained things very verbosely in a way that kind of felt like hand-holdy writing, to be honest. But aside from that, I think the script is still very tight, and it introduces a lot of elements early on that basically pay off throughout the film in sequence. And I think it's actually a much cleverer script than people giving credit for. And I'll sort of leave it on that. It's a great film. It's a really interesting way into a new universe. I really hope that this Superman and Pattinson's Batman do crossover. And I'll tell you why. First of all, because this film was good. If this film was bad, I would not. Because the Batman is fantastic. And you don't want it tainted. And I understand wanting to keep that contained. But if you don't keep it contained, if you do keep it contained, if you make it so that Matt Reeves' Batman universe is entirely self-contained, you're going to have two Batmen in like theaters at the same time, basically, in a larger sense of things, with the Brave and the Bold that they're trying to do. Which there's no way that's going to be directed by Andy Muschietti. There's no way. Because it's a terrible idea. But they're kind of about creating different tones anyway. And what works better than the darkest Batman and the brightest Superman we've ever had at the same time? Like, why would you not bring them together? They had such a perfect pairing. So I really hope they cave and do it. It only needs to be one off. I don't want Batman to appear in a David Corenswet Superman film, and I don't want Superman to appear in a Robert Pattinson Batman film. But I do want them to appear together in a World's Finest film and a Justice League film. It should be kept completely separate outside of those things, but they should still be able to interact. And I think that's okay. I won't be mad if that doesn't happen, but I am curious as to how they're going to get away with not doing that. Anyway, that's the end of this. Great film. Recommend that you see it. Next up, Fantastic Four. Who knows? That might have a more discussion-oriented review. We'll have to wait and see. Thanks for watching.